In this last lecture on punishment and sentencing, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the court decisions that have occurred over the years with regard to prisoners' rights and the role of the court in those rights. So let's take a little bit of a trip down memory lane, kind of through history. Until the mid-20th century, courts did not try to influence the internal management of prisons. And in fact, they left the management of the prison up to the local authorities and particularly the wardens of those prisons. And prison wardens held a huge position of power within prisons because they were the end-all, be-all in terms of how the prison was run. I don't. Most of you are way too young to remember this old movie, but if you love classic movies, one of the movies that you need to watch is Cool Hand Luke. It was a movie that was put out, I believe, in the 70s that basically highlighted how a prison could be run and the tremendous amount of power that a prison warden wielded within their own prison. So what basically happened was, judges didn't feel that they had the expertise to intervene in prison administration or in prison philosophy, so they really didn't do it. However, that started changing in the 1960s, and I think the reason why you got some movies in the 70s and 80s that, and I guess Cool Hand Luke was probably in the 70s, but one of the reasons why you got a change in this sort of thinking had to do with the Supreme Court. So in the 1960s, the Earl Warren Court provided some rights for prisoners. What happened was inmates sued for religious rights, and these inmates were they were members of the Nation of Islam or Black Muslims. What you saw was a lot of inmates during that time converting to religion, and they were converting to Islam. And of course, what they sued for was some religious rights within the prison. So, for example, to have a Quran instead of the Bible. That was not necessarily a right that was given to prisoners. To have meals that were pork-free. To hold religious meetings. The right to receive mail came about in the 60s. And the right to have law students and paralegals investigate their cases. So during this time then, during the 60s, the Earl Warren Court gave prisoners a bunch of rights and started to more intercede into the management of prisons themselves. In the 1970s, you saw even more of an influence from the courts. The court responded to class action suits from inmates again. And in the 70s, the courts defined minimal health standards and standards for discipline. So they're basically saying is, yes, the warden has some authority. However, these are the minimal standards that are required in any kind of prison. And if inmates are not treated according to those standards, they can sue. They have legal standing. The court also imposed limits on overcrowding, calling overcrowding to be cruel and unusual punishment. Okay, so what you saw was a shift from a hands-off view of prisoners to more of a hands-on view. However, you saw a change, a pendulum change. As many things happen when you have different administrations, different things happening, there are shifts in the thinking of the courts. So in the 1980s, you saw the Supreme Court retreating from some of their earlier positions. For example, in Rhodes versus Chapman in 1981, the Supreme Court actually ruled that as long as conditions were not grossly disproportionate to the severity of the crime, it would not be considered cruel. Now, what does grossly disproportionate to the severity of the crime suggest? What you got here is a new standard. Instead of saying that all humans have to be treated with a certain amount of dignity, now we're weighing in the severity of the crime that you committed in terms of what you are how you should be treated. And so if the severity of your crime was, if you committed a very severe crime, your treatment should, some kind of bad treatment shouldn't be a problem. Another thing that the court deemed acceptable was something that the earlier courts did not, which is what's called double sealing, which is holding two people in a 6 by 10 foot cell. The courts before that, at least the lower courts, ruled that as unacceptable, but in the Supreme Court decision in Rhodes versus Chapman, they decided that a double sealing was acceptable. So holding two people in a 6'10" cell was acceptable. So remember, earlier courts are saying that overcrowding is cruel and unusual, but this court is saying, yeah, but two people in a 6 by 10 cell is not overcrowding. The 1990s was a continuation of the 1980s. In Farmer versus Brenner in 1994, an inmate was raped by other inmates and sued the prison, and the courts ruled that the inmate would have to prove that the prison officials were reckless, not simply negligent, but reckless, in order for the inmate to be able to sue the prison. And then finally, in McGuckin versus Smith in 1992, giving more power again back to the prison warden. Whether a mentally ill inmate receives treatment is up to the warden. So you see, from the 1960s, just within 30 years, you saw the court sort of move one way and the other. So what about the 2000s? Well, there is some indication that the courts may be moving again. So you have Brown versus Planta in 2011. The court found egregious violations of prisoners' rights to mental health treatment in California prisons, and particularly the problem that they cited was that it was due to severe overcrowding. So because of severe overcrowding, prisoners' health and mental health treatment was being jeopardized. In fact, the Supreme Court ruled in this case, and the California system, and this is the California Supreme Court, I'm sorry, the Supreme Court ruled that California had to release 85,000 inmates in order to alleviate the crowding problem. So at the time of this case, California system had 156,000 inmates, and they had to release 85,000. So what they did was they released the nonviolent inmates. And in the 2000s, you're also seeing images like this appearing on the news. This is a California prison system, and this is how overcrowded it is. It's not just, you can see that they're stacked up here, 1, 2, 3, and look at how many people are in this room. So people started seeing these kind of conditions, and then you see the court cases. You also saw cartoons, political cartoons that kind of mocked the California system. So one of the reasons why the California system was so full was because California enacted a 3 strikes law. So 3 strikes and life in prison. And so you can see that in this particular cartoon, the 3 strikes pouring prisoners into the prison, making it burst, and then the Supreme Court, well, I guess it was the U.S. Supreme Court that issued this order, basically then pouring the prisoners out. So it was the case in which so many prisoners, and of course they released the nonviolent, mostly people who were in prison based on drug offenses. So, the Supreme Court has weighed in several times regarding prisons, and will probably continue to weigh in. But I don't know whether the pendulum is going to swing again. During the last administration, there was certainly some push to prison reform, criminal justice reform, but I think that is not an interest in the current administration. So before we end, let's talk about whether prison works. It's the standard, it's the thing we use in order to deal with criminals. And there are many goals of punishment. One is incapacitation. One of the goals of punishing people is to keep them from being able to commit another crime. And probably prisons do work with regard to incapacitation. I mean, once somebody's admitted into prison, the chances of escape are pretty much near zero. I mean, it does happen, but pretty much near zero. And the person while in prison can't commit another crime in our society. Obviously, they could commit a crime in prison, but they're really incapacitated and they're not able to prey on those of us in the community that are innocent. So in some ways, incapacitation is working. Prison does provide some incapacitation. The other side, the flip side to this is at what cost? The cost to house a prisoner is about $31,000 to $60,000 a year. And so that's quite expensive. It's quite an expensive method of incapacitation. And there's a growing concern in the prison administration community about aging prisoners because they cost more to house. So, for example, the cost of housing a prisoner 55 years or older jumps up to $80,000 a year because of medical costs and things like that. Another important reason for prison is deterrence, is to keep other people from committing crimes. So do prisons work in deterring others from committing crimes? That's hard to prove or disprove, but however, the research that we have suggests that prisons aren't really a very good deterrence. Would-be criminals don't seem to be deterred by the possibility of going to prison. Dozens of studies seem to show that there's no deterrence effect. And some researchers show that putting somebody in jail doesn't deter other people from committing crimes because there's a problem in the population of new recruits. So, for example, you take a drug runner out of the community and you put them into prison. They're now incapacitated. However, what happens is they just get another person to replace this drug runner. There's a job vacancy, so to speak, in the street, and somebody else steps in. So doesn't seem to be a real deterrence. Another goal of punishment is retribution. Retribution is the idea that, you need to be punished. You need to pay for your crime, and the public needs to see that bad people pay. In this way, prison probably is quite successful. The public shows a lot of support for our prison system. I talked last time about the Supermax. You saw that there was a tremendous amount of support for even some very, very harsh prison-like conditions. You saw that there was generally public support. People feel like when a person goes to prison, they're getting what's due to them. And so there is support from the general public for our prison system. So retribution, probably yes. The last piece is rehabilitation. And sadly, there's lots of data that shows that our prisons do not rehabilitate anyone. About 700,000 inmates are released every single year, and 67% of those will be rearrested, suggesting that they are not rehabilitated. And in fact, studies show that prison kind of has a criminogenic effect. It actually increases the likelihood of subsequent criminal behavior. So for example, there's one study that compared a group that went to prison with a group that got probation. Okay, they're matched for crimes. They're obviously not murder here. We're talking about maybe possibly drug crimes and things like that. So you had one group that got prison and one group that got probation, and they tracked this population for 3 years. What they found was that the drug offenders who got prison were 11% more likely than the other group to reoffend. And the property offenders were also 11% more likely to reoffend. So in other words, prison actually decreased the likelihood of rehabilitation. Also, recent studies show that prisoners who serve their whole time in prison are more likely to be reconvicted and reincarcerated than people who are released early due to prison overcrowding. So there was a natural experiment in California when they had to release all these prisoners. Those prisoners were not released because they were on good behavior. They were released because the court said so. And so you had a natural study to look at people who got stuck and people who were let go, and you matched for their crimes. And you found that people who ended up staying in prison were more likely to reoffend than people who were let go. So rehabilitation doesn't seem to be working. Okay. In fact, one criminologist, Curry, this is a quote from him, and probably expresses the frustration that people have that are working in the system. Any gains we get from incapacitation may be undercut by the tendency of imprisonment to produce crime. We get some payoff in crime reduction while offenders are actually behind bars, but what happens when they get out, as nearly all do? The experience of prison may, any of several ways, make prisoners worse, make them more rather than less likely to commit further offenses after they're released. So that's sort of not a very good assessment, but probably accurate. So how would we make things better? To end things on a more positive note, how would we make our prison system better? Well, one of the biggest ways that we can do this is to correct educational and job skills deficits while a person is incapacitated. And this would mean providing the ability for job training and to get an education. When I first came here to Wyoming in 1987, which is a long, long time ago, I taught an outreach class, and outreach was so different way back when. Yeah, you were using the phone, and I had sites around the state that I taught adolescent development to. And I did that for a couple of years when I first came here. And at that time, every single semester that I taught, I had one set of students who was in the Rawlins prison. This is the men's prison. And they were trying to get their degree, working on their bachelor's degree while they were in prison. Now, I would say maybe 5 years after I arrived here, there was a push to not allow prisoners to have all these great, wonderful things, and so they took this away from them. And I guess it's because people feel like, oh, they're not being punitive enough. It doesn't feel like they're getting the retribution. However, education and job skills have been shown to increase or decrease reincarceration rates. So correct educational job skills deficits so that when they get out, they have something that they can do. Another important thing is to change attitudes and thinking patterns that promote criminal thinking. Cognitive behavioral therapy, which has been a very successful therapy in treating depression and suicidal tendencies, cognitive behavioral therapy that focuses on criminal thinking has also been shown to be very effective. Studies show that it reduces recidivism by 1/3. And to be honest with you, if you can reduce recidivism by 1/3, that's a pretty powerful statement. However, as you know, mental health treatment is one of those things that's not available in most prison systems. But we have the tools. We have them. Improve self-awareness and self-esteem, again, working on mental health issues. Enhance interpersonal relationships. So, keep the ties to the families. What you find is that often when people are sent to prison, they're sent to a community that's far away from their family. And so it's very difficult for their families to maintain communications. You find that most men who are sent to prison do not expect to continue their relationship with their children while they're in prison, but enhancing that relationship might help. Another one is reducing drug abuse. Obviously, anything you can do to reduce any kind of abuse in and out of prison will be very helpful. And then, of course, reduce contact with criminal peers. And this is particularly important when the person leaves prison. And that includes the drug abuse too. So you can get people to do what you want them to do while they're incarcerated. But if you put them back into the same communities that they came from, and they get in touch with their criminal peers where drugs are rampant, those are the kinds of things that will lead to another incarceration. And so one of the things that increases rehabilitation is to have some kind of program for people when they leave prisons to let them reintegrate into society. So to offer ongoing support after the person leaves prison. Okay, so those are some recommendations. These are well-researched recommendations. Why don't we do this? Well, it's because there's a lack of will. Some of these things cost a little bit of money, a lot less than reincarceration, but there just doesn't seem to be any will in the public to do the kind of heavy lifting that it might take to make our prison system better. Okay, well, that's it. And don't forget to watch 13th, and we're all done with the course.